And yes, for folks who don't know us, we've been living here in Hattiesburg since 1960, and we've been social justice oriented since our founding. So it's a great space for active. And in terms of buying books from tonight's event, so there's copies on the back table, and you can see all right. So after the event, feel free to grab a copy, stick around at the time, and you'll purchase it on your way out at the register. Without further ado, thanks for being here.
So my name is Bennett. I'm an organizer with the Colonialism School, and I just wanted to welcome you all to the event. We're celebrating International Women's Day, and its radical roots by talking about Elisabeth Armstrong's book, Various Works of Colonialism, the Revolutionary Feminist Conference of 1949. And the panelists have offered to introduce themselves. So without further ado, I am going to let them get started. So thank you all for coming. And please feel free, if you want to get in touch and get on the email list for Colonialism School, please let me know and I will get you on. Yeah. So, all right, I'm gonna let them take it away.
Hello, everyone. Testing the mic. Is this good? Let me know. Okay, great. Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Angela Maskey. I am an organizer with the Claudia Jones School for Political Education here in DC. And I will be your moderator for this evening and asking some questions. But I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here in DC at Potter House and just getting a chance to talk with all of you. My name is Elisabeth Armstrong. I teach at Smith College in the program for the study of women and gender. And this book kind of came out of something else that I was working on, the Indian women's movement on the left. And so I fell into it and I really look forward to our conversation.
Fantastic. So let's go ahead and dive in. So before we get into, some of our more direct questions, so your book covers the 1949 Asian Women's Conference. Can you tell us a bit about the conference and the women who attended it?
Sure. So this is the conference that happened in December of 1949. It was organized in consultation with all of these women who were part of revolutionary movements across Asia, and they were working with an organization called the Women's International Democratic Federation. And this was a socialist, broad left, communist party grouping that had women from across mass movements as well as communist parties. It had a very large membership, and this conference came out of their opening dynamic. So they started, the WITF started in 1945, and right there in Paris, in the rubble of World War II, an argument broke out. So they started the organization. They're like, we are a women's anti-fascist organization. Well, at the conference were delegates from Morocco, from Algeria, from Vietnam, from China, from India. And they said, that's great. We're here for an anti-fascist women's movement. You have to say that we are also anti-racist and anti-colonial. And that was the moment that the organization took shape, because they took that on board. They took that as, how would you say it, a friendly amendment? They said, there's no way that we can talk about fascism and the anti-fascism if we aren't looking at the fascism in the colonies. And there was a speech by a delegate, Dong Tae Ho, who was from Vietnam, living in France. And many of the folks who were at this conference, if you know anything about visas after World War II, you couldn't get them, right? How were you going to get to Paris after the war when these colonizing powers were seeking to regain control over their colonies, right? So in the case of Vietnam, they had delegates that were coming from Vietnam, part of the Vietnamese Communist Party, part of the revolutionary movement, but they were already in France. And they were calling out the lack of attention to colonialism, even on the left, where there was an anti-colonial position, but it didn't go far enough. So this is the formation of the WIDF, and they immediately realized, so there's a woman named Thelma Dale, who's from the United States. She was part of the NCNW, the National Congress of Negro Women, and she said, absolutely not. Like, we have to look at the question of anti-racism and anti-colonialism, and we need to study it. If we didn't have it in our charter, like we had to add that in December of 1945, we actually need to know what we're talking about. And that's where they started by Black women who attended the conference. That was part of the study. They brought back the information on the Jim Crow United States, North and South. They brought back the analysis of the National Fair Labor Commission that was coming out of World War II. They brought back, and women from across the world that was colonized brought back, what is it to be colonized? What is this civilization that's being promised and never delivered? What is the truncation of lives, of liberty, of the right to any possibility of controlling your own lives? What does it mean? And so that's how they started. They went from country to country in a delegation. They met with left-wing women and they said, all right, now we need to know, we need to find out. They weren't allowed into all of these countries. They were not allowed into Vietnam. And those of you who keep an eye on Vietnam in 1945, in 1946, and 1947, it's a story about the France attempting to re-control after the Japanese left the region. They were like, no, we want that colony back. And in Vietnam, they're like, absolutely not. That is exactly what's not going to happen. So they start doing this research. Comes the demand for the conference. So this conference happened in 1949, but really the ground for it was laid from the very formation of the Women's International Democratic Federation. So let's see, you asked about, I wanted to mention one of the women that I didn't find out her whole story until after the book was out. Can I tell you her story now? Okay. So she was from Iran, and her name in the delegation was Mahim. For this kind of book, there's almost nothing in the archives. I spent a lot of time in archives looking, and I realized that I better start talking. So I reached out to my friends on the left who come from communist families and left-wing families in Iran, and I said, have you ever heard of Mahim Farouki? And they went and they talked to their grandparents and they talked to their cousins and they talked to people who were active in the movement in Iran, and they're like, no, that name does not ring a bell. So I searching just relentlessly throughout the process of writing this book, and I never figured out who she was, and the book was published and I used the name Mahim Farouki. Well, on the left, people, and what do you know? There I was one day preparing found a photograph from the archives, and somehow it's those things where you kick yourself later. On the flip side of this photograph, I'd seen this photograph so many times. This is all in Betty Millard's archives, which are housed where I teach by chance. And they didn't even come until I'd already started writing the book. So that's another thing. So I flipped the photograph and there's a picture of a woman. I'm like, huh, who's she? I don't recognize her. And on the back, it says Turan. And then in parentheses, it says her pseudonym. And I'm like, are you kidding me? So I start digging, and there's Turan Mirhabi. She's a Iranian woman. She's coming in 1946. She travels from Tehran. She comes to Paris to study at the Sorbonne. And when she gets there, she's shocked and horrified. She said it was absolutely rubble. She's given these interviews, and there's 2 films about her, and she's written her own biography. Like, turns out there's a lot of information on her. So she said she got to Paris and was horrified by what she saw, and she immediately took time off for education and went to Herzegovina and did work, reconstruction work in Eastern Europe. So while she's there, she's coming face to face with the devastation of the war and the impact in Iran. And she's already part of the left. She's part of the Organization of Iranian Women. And she comes back to Paris and starts getting involved. And she ends up being the delegate that I could not find her. She went to the conference in Moscow before this one that was held in Beijing. And then she took the train with about 50 other women from Moscow on the Trans-Siberian Express to Beijing. And she talks about this period and this conference in her biography, and I just wanted to share her story today because she's such an incredible woman. She ended up living in Iran for the rest of her life. She, after the revolution in 1979, her first husband was murdered for being a communist. Her second husband passed away soon thereafter. She stayed in Iran after 1979, immediately lost her job. She had started a children's school that was for girls and boys. And she refused to quit. So what she ended up doing, sorry, this is like way past the book, but I just have to tell you. That creating a companion that feels horrifically resonant. She begins in childhood. And she started collecting Iranian children's stories, which had not been written down. They were largely orally told to children. And she created an encyclopedia of children's stories that are passed among children. And it is still the recognized storehouse, treasure chest, really, of the stories of peace that children were grown up on for generations. And that's what she did after retiring, after having her school stolen from her. She just didn't give up. She's like, okay, I have no job. I'm going to do this other thing. So I wanted to keep her story because she didn't quite make it into the book.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it really makes me think of organizers on Signal nowadays using pseudonyms who are going to give scholars a headache in 100 years.
Just write on the backs of photographs, please.
Yeah. Make a note on your, yeah. So as I was reading, I was really struck by how so many of these themes are really relevant to the work that's going on today. And, actually, if you follow me on Instagram, you will have seen me post some quotes from the book, actually, because it was just so resonant. So to get to the question, so through the work of the conference, you note how these women crafted a dual strategy of anti-imperialist organizing, one strategy for the colonized and one for those in the colonizing countries. So how do these women view this strategy, and how can we apply the lessons of this history to the work we must do in supporting the Palestinian cause and the anti-colonial cause in general?
Yeah. So as I was writing this book, one of the questions I kept asking myself is, these theories never die. It's a little like the stories that Quran Madhabi was collecting. The stories, these are stories and lessons that we learn from the organizers that come before us. And I kept asking myself, these cannot be, first of all, they are probably not the beginning of these theories, and they certainly are not the end. So the way that they were theorizing it is there's a dual quality, there's an inside-outside quality. So are you within that location that's being colonized, or are you from the country that is doing the colonizing? There's no way not to see the relevance to what's happening right now. The connections that we are drawing between the US military contractors, the production of military hardware, the profiteering on the backs of the tens of thousands, we have made these connections. There's a way that these lessons refuse to die. And this is a conference that was actively suppressed. These findings, this theory, this strategy was, I am convinced, actively weeded out of the archive. The difficulty I had, I was spending time in archives that are deeply anti-imperialist archives. I did not go to US archives first. I did not go to European archives first. I knew this was an anti-imperialist story, and one needed that tradition to have the reverence, the respect for those theories. Even in those locations, it was hard to find. And that's why it became not just archives, but talking, because what I was hearing was not this conference being remembered, but these theories being remembered. So the other piece of it, and I think there are obviously things about this conference, 1949, right? Yet the PR Shanghai was still being strained with US. There was still a civil war finished up in 1940. People were coming from violent anti-colonial from Myanmar. They were walking then called Malaya, now Malaysia. That's time. Who only knows? Food. The fact that you're going to be meeting a border that is a. And so that question, well, it's not that it's, but it is. So this, the use of signal. Yeah, what's actually happening? What's we see through it? Who do we trust? Right? Those are questions we're navigating in this moment, I think, very skillfully. And it's in the face of just overt, flat out, no holds barred lies. So they're coming to a conference to share the truth. And the wall of propaganda was 10 feet deep. How are you going to find out what's happening in Vietnam? Yes, there were those comrades who were living in Paris, but how do you do that face to face? And so that's where those fact-finding missions were really important. And hopefully we'll get to it, but the Korean War, which is a parallel, thank you, Bennett, for reminding me, a parallel that we can't forget. So we have erased the memory of the Korean War. There's no way to what was happening. Really careful, thoughtful analysis. Was in many ways the first imperialist war of the US epoch that we are in today. So as we ask about Palestine, looking at that anti-war strategy of the Korean War is very important because it was one that was fought by US servicemen. And the war kept them in the conversation. So that fight against racism was part of the conversation about the particularly Black servicemen in the Korean War who came out on an anti-racist, anti-colonial refusal of the Korean War. So again, that nuance, that multiplicity, that connection, I think is important to find those places to remind ourselves of. Again, this is 10 feet deep. Propaganda runs thick.
Absolutely. And continuing to touch on the urgency of Palestine, in the book you say, quote, "To lie is a form of power since being believed is secondary to not being opposed. This feels particularly relevant in the wake of the mass media's partisan, as you were saying. Women's counter truth of
Similarities. Who went to this conference went as a guest, and her name was Jeanette Vermeersch. She in France. She was and this was a time when the French Communist Party, as I said before, fully renounced this. Well, this partial citizenship in Algeria, it's really pretty good because there's so many French Communist Party members in the government. Well, that didn't last for very long until about 1948. So Jeanette Vermeersch came from this conference after listening to this strategy. She was a deep, profound anti-colonial partisan. So she was speaking at the conference. There's a photograph. Vietnamese delegate who was able to get across that border. You probably know that China and Vietnam share a border. She could not get to the conference across that border. That's how strictly it was policed. She ended up having to take a ship to France and then another ship to Beijing. So
she's the one where it took her 6 months.
Took her 6 months. So she was supposed to get there in 6 weeks and help set up for the conference. Took her 6 months. Exactly right. So there's a photograph that I kept in the book of after Jeanette Vermeersch spoke. She gave her a huge hug, just like right there in the conference, because she's like, finally finally, we're getting the kind of support we need. So Jeanette Vermeersch comes back 1950 January. So the conference has ended 2 weeks ago. She gets onto the floor of the House of the Parliament, and she says, we, the French, are fighting an unjust war. The Vietnamese are fighting a just war. And that broke the house down. And that meant the WIDF was thrown out of France, leaving soon thereafter. And I think that's another question is where are the layers to the opposition? How can we build that level of popular support that pushes the, what's a fancy word for it? I'm thinking uppity ups, but that's not it. Those people like Jeanette Vermeer, she was as a member of parliament, to denounce not simply a fragment, but occupation itself, colonial occupation itself. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question to pose, and something I'm sure we'll all be thinking. So the women at this conference also have politics, which I found really interesting, which you call revolutionary motherhood. So within capitalist colonial logics, motherhood is often conceived of as in conservative terms. So how did these women reappropriate, if you will, the idea of motherhood for feminist, anti-imperialist and socialist aims?
Yeah. Just as an aside, a comrade from India who I've known for a very long time took me aside. I was in New Delhi. I was doing research on the next book, which is not disconnected from this book because it just got me thinking. And he said, you know, I was surprised you were so supportive of the way that they were framing revolutionary motherhood. So we talked it out and I said why I portrayed it the way I did. But the idea was in a Marxist context that motherhood is a social role. It is one that's been biologically ascribed. It's conservative sort of aspects to it. It means the privatization of reproductive labor, like that conservative aspect of motherhood, they did not accept at all, no part of it. But in fact, it was a fight at this conference. The truth is it was an argument. And the argument started in 1948 and it was hot. It might've been the hottest argument. And one of the things I'm really interested in this conference is not just where they agreed. I find that interesting. I find it interesting where they fought. They fought on this question of motherhood. And one of the things that came up in 1948, and it was a Swedish delegate who said, wow, we're sounding pretty left wing in Cold War times. How do we bring in more women? If we are going to be this hardcore on our anti-imperialist language, which she was fine with, she said, let's find a way to carry the message and let's do it through motherhood. That was a rough ride. It was an ongoing discussion is how I'll call it. And I think it was on the question of peace that so we know a kind of revolutionary motherhood speak that says, as the progenitors of the social fabric, right? As those who teach children in those old social roles, as the caregivers of children, women have a way of, maybe in Puran Hadith's way, that peace is learned in childhood, right? So women have that role in their traditional social roles. But what they wanted to do as well is say, even motherhood itself is not available to all. So if we think about who gets to be a in Asia, very few of the women who came to this conference had any access to the social role of motherhood. Many of them had children. So there were children that existed that they birthed. But they were revolutionaries. They were living in mountainous regions of their countries. Many of them left their kids with either their mother or their mother-in-law or an aunt or a sister. So motherhood was pretty remote for many of the people who were at this conference. I think the idea of packaging, I think the other part of the question is packaging for whom? Like for whom does a revolutionary motherhood sound safe? Or sound more digestible or more appealing? So there was all these layers to it alongside the kind of demands that we hear today, which is, why is motherhood a detriment? Why is motherhood mean that you have to erase yourself or you can only be that? Why is motherhood linked only to one biological destiny, right? So those critiques were there, but these other debates were hard too, right? Who are we making ourselves digestible for? And that's something that I really struggled with as I was writing the book. So it a little bit surprised me that my comrade in India thought I was being too nice, but you can judge for yourself.
In the book, you link the women at these conferences struggled against colonialism and patriarchy, arguing that, quote, neither national nor social self-determination could precede the other, since both were deeply embedded economic forms of enslavement to another's gain. Could you elaborate on how they combined these struggles and how they saw these as structurally contingent?
Yeah. So I forgot to say this. I had it in my head and it just flew away. So I'm going to add it here. With that two-part struggle, the inside-outside, the other piece of it is the local conditions will determine the struggles. So it's not that somehow you pick a template and you say inside, outside. You're in France, you're in Holland, you're in England, you're in the US, same. Instead, what they were creating was this kind of tensile, capacious commonality, because I think it's more than a solidarity. I think it was a common set of principles with a lot of room to say, well, where are we standing here? And when we ask the question of what they're demanding, the fight for patriarchy alongside the demand for national liberation and sovereignty and self-determination, let's take a couple of examples. So North Vietnam, one of the things that was emerging there were autonomous zones of communist governance. And one of the questions that they were taking up was the question of domestic violence within communist families. And rather than say, they said, we'll wait till after the revolution. That stereotype is a very tired one. They said, for us to be comrades in struggle, we have to have equal dignity. We have to have equal rights, absolutely. Equal rights to communal property, absolutely. But we also have to have bodily autonomy and equal dignity. And these are things that they took up. And there's two forms of this that I found from the same period, from the 40s. One in Bengal, which was in the Jabalpur region, which is now part of Bangladesh, where they produced councils of women, the Tevaga struggle, and they were the judges, the juries, and they followed up on domestic violence cases. So these were almost like legal tribunals that were run by community women around domestic violence cases. A similar form was emerging in North Vietnam at this period as well. So the ways that it took shape, I often, like in the abstract, it sounds great, but what does it mean at local levels? And what happened in the Jabalpur and Dinajpur as well, in West Bengal, is they said, we are fighting against the violence of landlords, of the zamindars and their henchmen who collect the rents. We are at the constant sexual beck and call of these men who hold so much power. How can we fight alongside our comrades for our right to the crop, our right to the land, our right to dignity, and be at the mercy of violence? We can't build a struggle like this. This is not a struggle we can win. And so it was both at the level, and I think what I've heard from folks is that doesn't sound feminist, but in fact, it's the material conditions of struggle that made that revolutionary feminism. It was a demand that was forged from struggle, from truths that they had built together. We together will fight jotidars and zamindars in Bengal. Together we have to fight the violence meted out by the hands of mother-in-laws and husbands.
That's amazing. I mean, I think that's another, lesson that is even brought through to today.
How so?
I think just, I think for many, women who are women on the left, I would say in general, that oftentimes in our organizing, we may feel the need to put our own identities aside in order to keep the peace or, just while working with our comrades. So that it's really interesting to me to learn about that history and like bring that forward as well. So many relevant lessons that we can learn from this work. So one of the things you touch on is the notion that communism simply duped by the so-called false promise of socialism that was supposedly only ever a masculinist tradition. So how does studying the women at this conference and their work provide us a counter narrative to this perspective?
Yeah, I struggled with this right through. And the idea of, does this make sense? The idea of the dupe? So one of the, it's like a hackneyed anti-communist thing where you say, well, this person, I really love the legacy of this person. She did really great work. Too bad about that Communist Party stuff. She didn't really know what she was getting into. And if we look at the House of Un-American Activities Committee, they trafficked in the language of the dupe all the time. Like, you poor little woman, you didn't really know what you fell into. And this was particularly true for African-American civil rights organizers. If anyone has a weird side hobby of reading HUAC trial hearings, you'll see it again and again. And I think there are ways that as historians, as academics, we do this all the time. So and as one writes, as one seeks to tell a story, one can fall into really bad habits. So part of me writing, I tried to keep a lot of the methodological stuff in the background for this book. I had to write that one out. Like, I had to write out the dupe, almost like purging the ghost out of this machine. Because obviously there is both a profound sexism and racism in that. I don't think we're aware of how deeply we swim in those waters. So that was a section that I wrote out rather than kind of kept it embedded. By talking about agency, so-and-so had agency, right, chose the path. I don't think that's good enough. Like, I think we need to think about a collectivity as well as an individual seeing and thinking. What does it mean to actively join a collective that is a left-wing collective? What does it mean to, let's say, write collectively or develop a collective policy? As well as a woman of color in this collective, you can't have had a meaningful contribution. Well, what the hell does that mean? What are we missing? And so that's kind of how I start. I realized one of my questions was, how did we allow this to be erased? How is that possible? The people who were involved in this conference ended up starting whole parties, ended up leading their countries. And Giselle Ravisahala from Madagascar is an incredible figure. She's loved in her country, and we know nothing of her. So it felt active. It didn't feel accidentally the files were lost. That might have happened too. But people are still alive, still breathing, like Quran Medhadi, still doing incredible things. How does that happen? And so maybe in a hidden way, I didn't say this, maybe we also are the dupe. What does it mean for us to be the dupes of our own history? How do we find the ways to see what isn't there, what's actively hidden? So yeah, that just popped in my head. But yeah, it became something I needed to say out loud rather than embed, because the dupe is our common sense. Even if we struggle not to have that be our way of seeing the world.
Wow, I'm not gonna lie, I'm processing that. My mind is like, whoa, mind blown right now. I'll be thinking about that, and I may have to send you an email or something to discuss further, honestly. Okay, so well, that's still, marinating in my brain. We're gonna get to our last question, and then we will be able to open it up to audience Q&A, which I'm sure you all have a lot marinating in there too. So being that we are the Claudia Jones School,
Yes.
we are particularly interested in the way Black communist women like Thelma Dale, Islanda Good Robeson, and others participated in the work of the WIDF. Could you touch on how these women advance their cause on the international scale through these alliances?
Yeah. I think that's why I'm just so incredibly happy to be here talking about this book. Claudia Jones did not go to, I'm just gonna quickly touch on her.
Please.
She did not attend the conference in 1949, as all of you know, she was battling the Smith Act. She was battling the US government. Islanda Robeson was as well. Paul Robeson had just given that speech in Europe at the peace conference where he said, there's no way I'm gonna die for what you call freedom here when I have no freedom. And that, right? So he gave that speech in 1949. US State Department was coming after him like a house on fire. Islanda Robeson was like, I gotta go, I'm doing this thing, gonna be back soon. She got her passport taken as soon as she got home. So the other person who wasn't able to come, I have to mention her, is Charlotta Bass from Los Angeles, amazing organizer, nationally known. So Claudia Jones, here she is being hounded. Folks come back from this conference, that International Women's Day, today, 1950, is when Claudia Jones wrote her speech that she credits for finally having her deported from the United States. So that speech came after this, and that ripple effect for me is indicative of what happened all over the world. So another person, Bea Alashishe, was coming from Algeria. She came back, again, early 1950, starts combing the country, giving speeches about what happened in Beijing. There's a painting of the Algerian dock workers' strike against Algerian soldiers going to Vietnam. And it's so incredible. It's held by Hungary. I couldn't get rights to put it in the book, but you can look it up online. It's there. And so what happened to these women who came back is they started talking about what they saw. They started talking about the strategies. And it was women from Algeria that held the strike of the dock workers in Oran in 1950. So the other person I wanted to quickly mention in response to this question is Ada Jackson. Has anyone kept an eyeball out for Ada Jackson? So unlike Claudia Jones, unlike Charlotta Bass, unlike Islanda Good Robeson, she was not nationally known, but she was locally known. So she was an organizer in Brooklyn. She went to the 1948 conference by the WIDF in Budapest, where like all hell was breaking loose, like the fights were happening. That's where like they were like, we are going to hammer out some unity. And so she was there. She also went to the Moscow meeting in 1949 that happened before this conference. She was on the train and went to Beijing. She was an organizer in Brooklyn. She was on the PTA. She was on the school board. She was her local rep. She was in Progressive Party politics, which was the third party. Hello, let's keep thinking, let's keep working, right? She was part of this like fiercely independent, fiercely progressive and communist movement that was coming out of Brooklyn. She was the local organizer. And one of the things she also had a national hand because she was running alongside better known figures like Maud Katz White and, oh my goodness, her name just dropped out of my head, but they were running the Rosalie Ingram case. So they were taking up the case of a woman from Alabama with 12 kids. They were using this language of revolutionary motherhood again on International Women's Day in 1949 to demand justice for Rosa Lee Ingram, who had killed the white sharecropper living next to her, who was sexually assaulting her, who was, and so Ada Jackson was part of this, like, incredible organizing. When we talk about the Cold War, we forget that folks organized right through the Cold War. They're like, yes, I'm being hauled up before the courts. Yes, I'm being deported. It didn't slow anybody down. The case of Ada Jackson, though, this is a story I don't know the end to. Sorry. I know this is a mean thing to do. Yeah, a little bit. It's a cliffhanger for me. It's slightly obsessed. She largely, I have a couple of photographs from this period. One of the things that happened, so she was a woman with an MA, she was well educated, and she was in the Jim Crow North. So she worked as a domestic worker in individual people's homes. Now, at this time, let's just think through, right? The House of Un-American Activities Committee, that was not just the State Department coming down on you. It was also a form of a social boycott, an economic boycott. So if you're working for, let's say, 4 different families to clean their houses, and they find out you're a communist, or they find out you're a communist and the State Department says that's bad, right? Because it's not like she was hiding before. That moment was a moment of deep protection as well. So there was a practice, and this is where my job gets a little squishy. I think it through a little harder to maybe occlude or hide the things that put particular people in more danger. The danger of losing one's job, the danger of losing one's apartment, the danger of your children losing their schooling, of your capacity to buy groceries, right? We think of this as abstract, or maybe the bummer of not having your passport. It was very material. And one of the questions I have always is, why does this get erased? Why does this get erased? With Ada Jackson, I'm wondering here about what is the production of erasure as a form of protection and resistance? And I don't know the full answer to this, but I can't let it go. I honor her because the work that she did was so powerful. I think when doing communist histories, not every erasure is the same.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. Can we get a round of applause? So now we are going to open up the floor for questions. I don't know how, if we want to run up the mic, or that would be great. Here, I'll go. Yeah.
So I really need some like hopium right now. Because like listening to you, and especially in the context of like them trying to ban TikTok, like, it feels like it's because of the kids being mad about the genocide. I'm pretty sure that's like the animating force. Like, what can we take from like thinking about these women, like all the struggles that people went through to get to this conference, and all the amazing work they did to take back, but then also looking at the globe and feeling like a feeling like a lot has been lost, like, right? Like there's no Soviet Union. There's like, we literally have China, a handful of like small socialist countries that feel like they don't have a lot of power. Like I'm thinking of Ursula Le Guin, right? Like the power of capitalism feels so unbeatable. Like what can we take from these people and apply it right now and like have hope that like we can defeat these motherfuckers?
Yeah, there it is. So I have a weird form of hope. I'm just gonna like, I don't know, I wish it had the opium side of the hope, but the title for me is, again, I don't know if hope's the word, but this is a slogan from the conference, bury the corpse of colonialism. Now, if you think about 1949 and you think about colonialism, how many of these folks were done with colonialism in that particular form? 1949, we had the formation of East-West Pakistan. We had the formation of India in 1947. That's about it. Brakes are on. But they could have as their slogan, bury the corpse. They were like, hello, that's already dead. You don't know it yet, but we're gonna help you see. And by the way, we've got the pit right here.
Yeah.
So I think of struggle as the digging. I think of our knowledge that if a system is built on death, hatred, bigotry, murder, erasure, genocide, I think it needs to be a corpse. And that's, again, I have a sick form of hope. But I think there's hope in that title because it says, we see all your propaganda hasn't stopped us from seeing that colonialism is a corpse, even while you are dumping weaponry on Vietnam. Think about Vietnam, 1975. This is 1949. Vietnam was like, no, corpse, corpse. We see you with your guns, but y'all are a corpse. So I guess that's where it's a form of clear-sighted realism with reality not yet meeting the vision. Does that make sense? And again, the hopium side is a little lot there. Thanks for that.
So you mentioned the Korean War, like looming large at this moment, and you said like the US intervention in Korea, but like the thing about the Korean War was that it was a UN intervention in Korea. And like when thinking about like an international women's conference, like right now we would think of that under the aegis of the UN. Like I think these women could see that like the UN was an imperial entity at that point, and maybe still is. It's, you know, like so I guess like maybe just like talking about like international institutions as they existed back then and as they exist now and how that has changed. Yeah.
So with the UN and NATO, how would you say, gave benediction to the US invasion of Korea. The forces were US forces, but you're right, the UN, it was the UN, as you're correctly saying, from the very beginning was a site of struggle, and the WIDF was right there in the thick of things. So if we look at the formation of the Human Rights Commission, there's parts of the UN where you can see that struggle that remained. I think they were both truthful. So in 1948, they the very first image for their conference proceedings was a picture from, this is going to be gross, I don't know, I guess that's what we're talking about. They were a picture of from Indonesia of people's heads on sticks. And it was a photograph, it's the only photograph, and it's the first one, and it says, the UN, the United Nations supports the universal human rights. These are the universal human rights they refuse to support. And so they were calling out the UN's complicity with the counterinsurgency and the violence by, in this case, the Dutch. So I think, again, they just never let it pass. And I think it comes back to the question of power and deceit and propaganda. If one refuses to believe the lies, that's perhaps the most powerful resistance in the moment that we're in. And I think it's what's so stunning about right now is that refusal. So TikTok gets banned, something else is coming. And the refusal to accept or to keep private the lie. And I think the UN just continues and continued then to be a location of struggle. I think the South African government showed how to use it as a stage to show up the hypocrisy while still demanding that it rise to its promises. Does that make sense? I think we're seeing at this moment techniques. So one of the techniques, I just have to say it, so at this conference in 1949, Pak Janai, who was came from Korea. There was a huge contingent coming from Korea. She stood up and she said, the invasion is imminent. It's within months. Go home and tell everybody. And you women from the United States, get ready. And it was precisely the question of the Korean War that Claudia Jones wrote about in 1950 on this very day. So that message got passed. I think the other thing they did is they had a contingent and they studied what happened in North Korea. And they brought the UN in on the Geneva Conventions of violation of human rights and the use of chemical weapons. So this was a first. They'd never before, and there were only women on that contingent. And this, I think, if we go back to revolutionary motherhood, this is where they were taking that icon of the woman as the peace holder in that traditionalist way and throwing it for a loop, because they were out there in active bombing sites. They were across North Korea, and a beloved colleague of mine, Susie Kim, found all of the footage from that trip in the Garth archives in Moscow and has had them restored. And they took absolutely, I mean, back then a photograph was valuable because it was a kind of incontrovertible truth, and showed, first of all, the carpet bombing across whole regions, but also showed proof of the use of chemical warfare, which was explicitly made illegal by the Geneva Conventions. So I think there's some of that that's happening in a particular way now. We don't get to repeat history, but we do have a way of looping it. Yeah. So I just wanted to bring that up because they were very strategic and tactical. They didn't leave the field to the assholes, right? They were like, we're gonna keep staging our refusal to do what you promised to do. In this case, uphold the Geneva Conventions. Thank you for that question.
Now, that's a question. The UN ended the Korean War, as I recall, because the Soviets boycotted the Security Council, and so they made a tactical mistake. That's what enabled the UN to officially enter the Korean War. But there was no veto in the Security Council, and then we see now that the US is the only power in the Security Council that's vetoing ceasefire. So we see a great shift, and also, of course, the vote in the General Assembly on against to lift the Cuban embargo, with the only US and Israel voting against 184 countries. So I think I share your optimism that there is a shift in global public opinion that's reflected in the nations all over the world. And so in a note of your optimism, the solidarity which you speak of in this conference, it seems to be greatly magnified by what we witness all over the world in the opposition to Israeli genocide. I mean, so many people are coming out all over the world. The growth of the global BDS movement, which I think is critical now. So thank you. I'm going to get your book. Appreciate your insights in that.
Hi, thank you so much. Glad to be here, and I just want to wish everyone a very, very happy International Women's Day. Very exciting. A class of 50% of our world population throughout history. So Yay, how exciting. All right, so a couple things I wanted to just say in your book, I really appreciated the language that you use. It feels quite accessible. Not all language in academic books is accessible, and so I just really appreciate that you use that language. I was also going to mention, I know people who attended the 1995 Beijing Women's Conference. And they, apparently there were quite a few lesbian speakers who spoke about lesbian rights at the conference. And, every single recording or, video of every single one of those speakers vanished. So they're not available. Yeah, and so one of the attendees actually, to counter that, she has every 5 years, she has been making a documentary film following women who were there and sort of how they've taken the exciting things that they've done at that conference out into the world. But anyway, so you've spoken a lot about erasure. So this is very systematic. So I think it's helpful for people to know that, you know, it's happening in various settings.
There is a film that I can tell you about
Yeah.
afterwards that
Okay.
has those speeches
Okay.
by lesbian activists at the NGO conference, the one in Cairo in 1995.
No, this was in Beijing.
Well, the UN part was in Beijing,
Yeah.
but there was also the NGO conference connected to it was in Cairo. I have a good film.
Oh, okay. I'm
Yeah.
happy about that.
But I agree with you, there is still systematic erasure.
Then I was also gonna mention, so I've been reading a lot about the, communist women and the communist feminist, movement, in the US, like in the 40s, well, actually going back earlier, but, 30s. And so they were making the parallel between male supremacy and white supremacy, as both, serving the elites because it divides us, and also along, national and ethnic lines. And that for both, for these different oppressions, that there is both a structural component and then a very powerful ideological component, and that it's helpful to look at those separately and address them separately, and that the enforcement of the one is via rape, and then the enforcement of the other, certainly in the United States, unfortunately, was lynching, and that it was helpful to see them as parallel, because we're again talking about the oppression of 50% of the population along these lines. So I thought that was an interesting way of looking at it, but I hadn't always heard it. I'll just wind up with just inviting my sisters here to also participate in this really exciting event. Thank you so much. I'll pass. Thanks.
Just one fun fact, there was a lesbian attendee at this conference, at least one. Betty Millard was a lesbian and a member of the US Communist Party, and she was one of the attendees, and she had a very close relationship that I would love for you to touch on if you want to take a little time to talk about Betty.
Yeah, sure. So Betty Millard was a US Communist Party member. She was a white woman from a fairly wealthy family, conservative family. She came from Chicago. I always mix up if she went to Barnard or Vassar. I think it was Vassar, but now my brain is playing tricks on me. And she took copious notes. She ended up working in the WIDF central offices when they were in Paris. She got there in 1948 and she left in 1951, I think. And she writes in her memoir that it was the first time when she was living in Paris where she felt comfortable with her sexuality. She felt comfortable about being attracted to women, that she finally saw around her public same-sex intimacy, and that was incredibly moving for her. So it's something I write about in the second chapter a little bit more. There was an argument that happened in the train. Again, I told you, as much as I love solidarity, I'm here for the fights, and
Even on that train.
they were and they were pretending it was about smoking. So one of the kind of the slams that happened was, I think, about Betty Millard's sexuality, and I think it was about her charisma in particular. I think that there was kind of a throwaway remark. It might have been Jeanette Vermeer. It was. She said, "Oh, well, some of you just want to be like Casanova." And, I don't know, later Betty Millard, wrote in her diary, she's like, she like lists who her allies were in the fight. This was a multi-day fight. They didn't like get all the fighting done in one day. They're on a train, they're on that train for 12 days. So, and, she said, you know, I should have fought back more. And, she's naming the different people who were like, hey, you're in the right, go in there, like duke it out. And apparently she feels like she was a little low key at that moment, but she should have stepped up a little harder with, Jeanette Vermeer's comment. Most of the time Betty Millard is, when you see pictures of her, she's just very charismatic. She's very animated and she's always up to antics. So I kept one of her antics photos. It's a picture of her and her close friend, some Geeta Bandyopadhyay, who, when I started writing about her in India, most folks didn't remember her. I spent a lot of time in Calcutta and it was now called Kolkata. And it turns out one of my closest colleagues, her mother knew her very well. Her mother was so excited I was writing her into the chapter that she wrote her own reminiscences of her. She got me her Geeta Bandyopadhyay's Bengali memoir. I've now had it translated. It's coming out as a publication. But these two best friends, there's one photograph of the two of them. Their letters are fabulous. It's Betty Millard and Geeta are both in sort of, I think it's a young pioneers outfit, like with the little scarf and the little shorts and maybe it's pants, but, and then everybody else, they're all East German women are in saris and they're singing it up. And I have a few different versions. So it was a big dilemma of which one to stick in this book. But Betty Millard really played a huge part at this opening moment of the WIDF. And I think for her, it was an incredibly pivotal moment for her sexuality and for her comfortability with her sexuality and her attraction to women. I think, you know, that she did a lot of coding in her memoirs, or in her notebooks. So I spent a lot of time like wondering, like, I'm like, I can't, like, how far do I go in my strategic reading of this? But yeah, she was open. She was sort of beloved. She had all of these like people who would stick up for her when she was getting called out on the train.
I love that. I love that story about the train. It's so interesting. There's little like beeping on the train.
And like who was in first class? Yeah, that one made sense. For a bunch of communist women, like, you guys are in first class, what's wrong with you?
All right, we have time for like maybe one or two more questions. If any women have questions.
Can I pay for the book out there? That's
Yes,
my
so
question.
you will pay for the yes, good question.
Thank you for catching me.
Anybody else have questions? Okay.
I just want to know about the historical context, like, how is this, you said like there was, you know, you're surprised at the erasure, like, how is this perceived and taken by, you know, the Communist Party in China, by the Soviets, like,
Now,
at the time?
oh, at the time,
Like, you know,
I loved it.
like, you know, was it actually talked about, like, in, you know, like taken by these politicians and brought back to those countries, or was it also, you know, erased or?
Yeah, so that was my question. I think, so because my own ties are the strongest not in Russia, and I have a better sense of what happened around Asia. It came back, and North Africa in particular. I think in the USSR, I have been told by friends who were able to go through the archives that the materials I ended up finding in Sweden are not there. I have been told, I have not gone through the records in Berlin, but I've been told by Francesca Dehaan, who's writing sort of the definitive history of WIDF right now. She's on the verge of finishing, she keeps telling me, that they weren't there either. So it really was a question for me in terms of what was happening she says that they were, again, conspiracy theories, that these particular records were taken out of the Berlin archives with the fall of the Berlin Wall, that they were popped into somebody's suitcase, and she won't tell me who, but I know she knows. When she sees this video, she's gonna be like, yeah, so that is a question. Why in 1991 were these the records, if that's true, right? I don't know. Why were these the records that were like, let me slip these into my briefcase and tootle off? So I do still have a lot of questions about that. I think the anti-colonial line remained. In China, the leaders who were part of this conference remained Sai Chang, Deng Chao. These were all incredibly important women's leaders and feminist leaders and leaders of the women's mass organization in China. So my assumption is that it did matter. It's how much it was disseminated and where was it disseminated. And that was an answer. It was easier for me to find that answer in some places than on others. So I don't know how it was disseminated in USSR, and I don't know how it was disseminated in, oh yeah, I have some idea with China. Thank goodness for the CIA. They gave you some details.
All right. Room for one more question.
Yeah, I'm just curious, you indicated that your next project, builds on some, or it's connected, and I'm wondering if you'll indulge us by telling us a little bit about sort of in finishing this, where it left you, and then how, what's next project is that's come out of it.
Yeah. So as I was trying to figure out how this conference, where it happened and why it happened in China, it was supposed to happen in Kolkata in 1948. And so that started to interest me a lot. And then as I was focusing on Gita Bandyopadhyay, this whole wealth of information and people and contacts and documents and police records, people now just send me presents. So I have many, many presents. I have always been curious why. 1948, it was a difficult time to be a communist in 1948. Nehru, and by 1948, was pretty wary, scared of the CPI. Okay, that's a really long road. I'm getting there. There was a student and youth conference that happened in February of 1948 that 3 months later, revolutions broke out in 4 different countries, including Indonesia, Malaya, what was then Malaya, Myanmar, what was then Burma, and the Philippines. And nobody saw it coming. The Soviets did not see it. That I found all the records. So I just became curious about that February moment. And it now turns out that these lovely people who send me presents have given me a whole lot of information. And I'd like to tell that story. One of the characters I follow is a woman named Lila Suripno. Her partner, who's only known by the name Suripno, was shot a year before she went to Beijing. And in 1948, he was at that conference in Kolkata with a woman named Kitty Boomla. And so I've been collecting information on Kitty Boomla, and then another woman named Vidya Kanuga, who's in both stories, and then Suripno through Lila. And that's where I am right now. I don't know what form it'll take. And that question you said about writing this in an accessible way, I'm trying to figure out the form. I think I have a pretty good idea of most of the story or some of the story. But for me, it's become as much a question of how to tell the story. Because I like stories that help us ask better questions. I'm not always sure that they can give us the answer or the answers we want, but I think they can help us ask better questions. And so I like to write so that I'm not telling you the answer, so that we collectively ask the questions together. We are doing very human.
So I am going to be selfish and ask you a final question. Because I forgot to tell people to ask questions. So my question is, you talk a lot about the struggle for peace in this book, and I want to know, like, kind of trying to leave it off on an empowering note. What was the future? What was the peace? What did peace mean to these women, and what exactly was it that they were fighting for? Because I think that there's a lot of contention around the word peace right now, and I think that we have to be clear about what we mean by peace as partisans of liberation, as partisans of justice.
You're so right, you're so right. So actually, Kitty Boomla is really helpful for this. So I have Turan Murhadi's that peace is learned in childhood. I think there's something that it means that it's a building block, right? It is part of who and what and how we live. Kitty Boomla made this statement. She was visiting the 1948 conference. As I said, she was part of the student and youth movement, and she was fierce. I always fall in love with these characters. I'm totally love Kitty Boomla as well. So she was this fierce speaker, and she stood up. It's not even her meeting. This is the Women's International Democratic Federation. She stood up and she said, peace is an active state. And ever since then, I've been like, first of all, I became obsessed with her. They spelled her name wrong, and I just figured out who she was. They called her Cuddy Hookham. I'm like, please. Her name is Kitty Boomla. She later was known as Kitty Menon. She became a professor at DU at Delhi University, and didn't publish but organized all the time. She was a hardcore organizer right through the anti-Sikh riots, right through emergency. I mean, just a fierce fighter. So peace is an active state. That to me right there sums up the vision that we see. Peace isn't something that is the absence of war. Peace is the fullest possible vision of a world we need to live in, the world we need to have. And that's the piece that they would articulate again and again. If you go through these records, you hear them say, we need free childcare. We need schools where our children are happy. We need a place to rest, to sing, to write poetry. We need peace as the possibility of horizons we didn't know existed. So peace is an active state. It's like peace is the thing we never stop building. It's the vision that can only grow on itself. I think again, I mean, that's a beautiful vision. Again, it's the thing we build by walking. And I think that in that walk, as you say, it's a set of debates right now. How do we allow the debates to build a better vision rather than to break us back down? How do we allow the debates to actually strengthen the connections we have with each other in spite of maybe some of the differences that we're coming to? And that's a hard one. That was hard at this conference. That was hard in the language and the goals. I mean, the demand for the use of anti-imperialism, that was demand. We think about the 1945 conference, the demand for anti-racism and anti-colonialism to be side by side with anti-fascism, that was fought for. So it's not that unity, solidarity, I don't want to put too high a sheen on their beauty because they're built out of these harder moments. Yeah.
So thank you again for all. So folks can grab a book and then get it signed and make sure to purchase it on the way out. But also before you go, I did get you a little gift that is kind of related to the book. So I would like you to have that as a thank you for doing this event. If you
Should I
want-
open it?
Yes, open it.
We're all watching.
No pressure.